panels, one thing that I agree with PM is that these states need legitimacy. Their side has never even once proven to you how they get legitimacy under their side for all of those reasons proposed. But then a few points on, but then I think government's definition of top-down was very uncharitable in this debate, right? So one point on clarification before I move on to rebuttals then. Firstly, I don't think that top-down just looks like a focus on like one specific individual. I think it looks like books telling us about the nation's history as a whole via like how the government was able to like step up during times of conflict, or who are the leaders, for example, who led certain wars and who are the ones that paved the way for history. But then moving on to rebuttals then, their idea on like, only on our side, elitist people are going to be championed. I have two responses to this. I think that firstly, simply that people don't care about this, right, when learning history, refers to like Kartini, who was like rich and basically came from a family of nobility. Her story is still very important towards the people in Indonesia today, and her story was still able to inspire people, right? But then secondly, I think this harm is symmetric at best, right? I think that biased point of views will still exist under your side of the house. In fact, it's going to be much worse because the ordinary people have the incentive of things like, for example, finding glory, so they hyperbolize things that they go through, or they simply come from marginalized upbringings, which means that it's very different to the conditions that are currently existing in post-conflict states, meaning that people under your side won't be able to relate. But then second thing here then, on like how top-down is less understandable for people. And firstly, top-down is comparatively easier for people to actually understand because you don't actually have to analyze every single nook and cranny on how certain things influence the other things in society, right? But then I think the comparative under your side is that understanding is going to be much worse because the barrier of entry to actually understand these things are very high, right? That is to say, you need to understand the basic concepts of sociology and how it works, how certain actors can affect the things that happen in a bigger scale. But then moving on to my arguments then. First argument on how state simply gets better legitimacy under our side. Note that this is important because this is a priori to all of PM's benefits. I think the premise of this is fairly simple. I think that in these states, governance is still relatively new, right? The ones in power still lack the legitimacy from the people because they're either the ones that came before them were bad, for example, hence people don't really have that sense of trust, or simply because the people are still shaken up, right, from these conflicts, which means that the negative implications of this lack of legitimacy is threefold. Firstly, when people don't trust the government, they won't trust or like follow the rules or like regulations that are being enforced. This is simply bad because whenever the governments want to implement things like, for example, social aid and etc., then people won't want to reap the benefits or comply with the laws being given, right? I think this looks like people refusing to pay taxes or take part in elections, which is bad because it means people can't get their promised taxpayer benefits or their rights as societies of like certain nations fulfilled by governments. But then what this means is that you're not going to get social cohesion under your side of the house, and you're going to be enforcing a cycle of blameage within the people towards the government, right? Note that this is dangerous because these institutions are already fragile, meaning if a revolution or a riot were to happen due to the lack of trust, all of the progress that has already been achieved will be reset to zero, will be back to the unstable conditions that have already happened. But then secondly, I think the lack of legitimacy makes it easier to polarize the people, right? Because no one has a specific body of belief to actually hold on to. I think this means three possibilities then. One, people get separated or form unity from their own ethnic groups or like random political groups. This is also further enforced by the bottom-up teachings that they champion under their side, because teaching about ordinary people or their social groups that are very diverse pushes forward the sense of pride or like valorization of certain groups of people, i.e. refer to how it's likelier for like Chinese Indonesians to want to listen to the ethnic stories or like the textbook stories of the Chinese Indonesian ancestors that has come before them, further enforcing an echo chamber effect that proves to you that these people are only going to follow the certain sets of beliefs that they want to listen to, right? But then secondly, I think this makes it easier for other nations or like opposition parties to step in and wreak havoc, further worsening the stability that is already like lacking under your side of the house, right? But then thirdly, I think political instability is going to go up under your side simply because the separatist groups or like opposition parties are given a form of justification to be anarchist, for example, to sell the idea to the people, simply because it's seen as the state is unable to like give these people the rights that they deserve, and etc. But then how do you get legitimacy under our side then? I think it's two ways. One, the top-down historiography gives the people a common or like central doctrine that is surrounding leaders, right? Or like leading institutions, or simply like the written constitution that came after the war, the previous war efforts, etc. I think it's important to note that the biggest characteristic of people of these post-conflict states are people who have different identities and etc. Right? This is why my point previously works, meaning that when you teach people one form of a story one form of a story on like the bigger scale of things, at the very least you give the idea that there is still a nation that they are worth belonging to, because it's seen as, oh, these nations have fought for me previously. But then secondly, I think that we reinforce the idea of credibility and authority that these states bodies have by showing people who fought for the country who fought for the country in such insane ways, for example, that they have done XYZ, they were the ones that ended conflicts, and etc. People are more prone to the idea of trust when they see that when the government previously has fought for their freedom. But then why is this important, and how should you weigh this argument then? I think that one, you should weigh this on simply how this is a priori to all of PM's benefits. Our case weighs above governments because legitimacy is the prerequisite of things like, for example, nationalism or like proper political discourse. You're unable to get political discourse, for example, under their side, simply because people don't trust the government. People don't know what proper governance is supposed to look like, and they can't perform things like, they are unlikely to opt into things like, for example, elections, because they think that the system is corrupt anyways, and there's no point in them doing these things, which means you get no political discourse under their side and no form of like political change. But then secondly, I think that if people don't trust the state, then they will reject all things like, for example, the institutions and also like all of the reconciliation efforts or like the government programs in the first place, meaning that it's also impossible for the government under their side to like actually reach the people and help the people. This is bad. This is bad because the very principle of governance on its own tells you that they have a moral obligation to serve the people, and which also means that they have the principle obligation to want to tell people the things, to want to teach people the things that will incentivize them to actually listen to the government, right? But then secondly, I think you should weigh this on exclusivity. I think legitimacy is only gotten under our side because only our side pushes the importance of governance, right? The comparative under their side is that their side has no form of mechanism that is able to provide the local governance any form of legitimacy, simply because people don't see the importance of the big central government within their countries, right? Meaning that they will only relate to the small groups of people who don't have any form of political power at the end of the day, under their side, simply meaning that these people don't trust the government because the people that are in government aren't the people that they actually believe in, the people that they have learned about, but the government is like painted as the things that are like, for example, elitist that you kept trying to say, or like, yeah, people who are simply privileged and out of touch and corrupt and etc. Choice is clear, vote for op.